And so, bienvenue, welcome to Old Jewish Montreal. I'm standing here on St. Urban Street in the heart of Dudi Kravitz country, the Amolige Gegend, der alter Yiddischer Montreal. And across from me is one of the oldest surviving extant synagogue buildings in the city. One of the truly remarkable and beautiful things about this building behind me is not only that it is the oldest extant synagogue building whose exterior has not been altered at all, but one can very clearly see the inscription, Beit HaMidrash HaGadol Chevra Shas, on the building, unaltered. Today it is a Portuguese church. This street, St. Urban Street, was made famous, of course, by Mordechai Richler in his novels, but Richler's grandfather, the famous Rabbi Yudel Rosenberg, the chief rabbi of Montreal, served for a time as the rabbi of this congregation. As for its cantor, the legendary Yehoshua Shuram was the cantor of the Beis HaMidrash HaGadol for many years before it finally moved to Snowden. Well, here we are in one of the hippest areas in Montreal. There was a time when this area was considered hip for a totally different reason, and that is that hideously ugly building behind me, Le Collège Français, a classic example of 1960s architecture. But if one looks above the facade, one sees the magnificence of what once was the Carnegie Hall of Montreal cantorial music. This was the synagogue, the B'nai Jacob synagogue, where the greatest cantors in the world performed. If one looks at a list of Montreal cantors, one will see that over the course of about a half century, almost 20 cantors were employed by this synagogue. And that's because this synagogue was established by Russian Jews, Litvaks, who were very fussy about everything, from Talmudic learning to the quality of cantorial music. In fact, given that this was the shul of the Litvaks, perhaps a change of wardrobe is appropriate. I recall as a child going to the synagogue, but even more importantly for me personally, my father was a child who prayed in this synagogue and sang as the head tenor of its choir. The synagogue was established in 1918, and beginning in the early 1920s, they began engaging the world's most famous cantors, from David Reutemann to Kapov Kagan to David Katzman. David Katzman left the synagogue in 1932 for one reason only. He was the choice to replace the king of cantors, Yossele Rosenblatt, in New York City. Well, standing at this corner, we're reminded that the B'nai Jacob was not the only major Jewish institution in this neighborhood. The Jewish community of Montreal was always a pluralistic community that included secular as well as religious Jews. This building over here was the Yiddish Volksschule, the Jewish People's School, which was an ardently secular Yiddish institution, the parents of whose children would rarely step foot in a synagogue, and yet they lived in harmony just across the road from one another. One of the most beautiful and scenic corners in Outremont, with trendy cafes all around us and in back of us, the Ukrainian Community Center of Montreal, a reminder of just how cosmopolitan this city is. Once this building was home to the Chevra Kadisha synagogue. It was built as a synagogue in 1922 and served as such until 1955. Its main competitor, and it was really always overshadowed by, the B'nai Jacob synagogue. Very often, when B'nai Jacob would fire one of its cantors, which happened every year or two, the Chevra Kadisha would attempt to pick up, sometimes successfully, and sometimes, for the more talented and ambitious cantors, they would return to New York and decline the offer from the Chevra Kadisha. The best-known cantor to serve at the Chevra Kadisha was the much-beloved Yehoshua Rosenzweig, who went on to serve for many decades. The Chevra Kadisha synagogue, ironically, eventually amalgamated with the B'nai Jacob and is today the Chevra Kadisha B'nai Jacob synagogue on Clanranald Avenue. Well, we're standing here on St. Joseph Street, which was the home for many decades of the Best David Shul, which was more popularly known as the Romanischer Shul. Those whose tastes in cantorial music were more exotic would come here instead of the B'nai Jacob. This was the other temple, Carnegie Hall of Chazanut. And among the many famous cantors who sang here was the legendary Ephraim Schlepak, known as Das Fiddler, the fiddle, because of the lyricality of his voice, and the much beloved Yehoshua Dlin. Dlin came from the great synagogue in Tel Aviv to serve at the Beth David when it merged with Tiferet Yerushalayim and became known as the TBDJ, the popular synagogue in Côte St. Luc to this day. Well, this building, the former Adath Israel Synagogue, established in 1940, will certainly be familiar, at least from its exterior, to Rabbi Shushat, who prayed here as a child and as a young man, as did I. Rabbi Lefel was an active member of the synagogue. And this synagogue was the first modern Orthodox synagogue in Montreal, which means that it established a modern aesthetic. This building today serves as a Maronite Lebanese church. Most of the physical Hebrew symbols that were inscribed on the front of the building have been effaced. However, if you look closely enough, you will find one remnant, the Stars of David, that are still inscribed on the stained glass in the front of the building. Two very famous cantors chanted here. In the late 1940s, Eugene Goldberger, and when he retired in '65, Cantor Benjamin Haas, the scion of a very famous cantorial family. Both were wonderful cantors. And most significantly, this was the first synagogue in Montreal that had a professional, that is to say a paid, not a children's choir, that accompanied the cantor every Saturday. So this really was a temple of cantorial music in the modern sense of the word.
Hineno el hatloa v'yal lechatoa tzadek tz'akecha ma'afli floav kishav no chinenam Elohim Adonai Tevah